Thank you everybody for coming. I think a lot of you have already heard a lot of our presentations. You already know Master Gardener Volunteers is a volunteer organization focused on helping homeowners with their gardening issues and helping learn gardening. So today's presentation is on invasive plants. So we're going to talk about a bunch of invasive plants, and we'll probably go through some of them fairly quickly, and we probably will have way more invasive plants than we can get a chance to talk about today, even within our presentation. You have a list that we gave you as a handout today. Hopefully you all got that. That's over there on the table. That is a list of plants that have been termed invasive by the state of Ohio and actually are illegal to propagate, sell, distribute within the state of Ohio. So just so that you have that to be aware of. So before we get started on our actual presentation, if you have any additional questions, we have a helpline. It is manned on Tuesday mornings from 9 to 11 from the 1st of April to the end of October, right, Dave?
Right.
Okay. Dave is one of our helpline people. And if you call and leave a message or send an email to that and it's not on Tuesday morning, they will get back to you on Tuesday morning. So, but that's because that's the time period that they're actually there. So just wanted to let you guys know that so that you have that information. Okay, so we're going to talk about what is an invasive plant, why is it an issue, and then we're going to jump into talking about a bunch of different plants. So, what is an invasive plant? The Ohio Department of Agriculture defines an invasive plant as a plant that is not native to Ohio, whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm, or harm to human health as determined by scientific studies. That's a lot of words and big words and stuff. I like Cornell's definition: a plant that is capable of moving aggressively into a habitat and monopolizes resources such as light, water, nutrients, space, to the detriment of other species. And we had a pre-meeting conversation with somebody here earlier that one of the things about these particular plants that we're going to talk about here is not only are they invasive within your yard, they easily spread outside of your yard. And we will talk a little bit about how that works and how that happens. We will leave time for questions at the end, so I'm going to ask actually for the most part that you kind of leave your questions to the end unless it's very specific about a particular plant that we're talking about. So we'll start off with what are invasives, why are they an issue?
Why do we care about these? I think the problem with invasive plants is it presents kind of an irony. If you go to the nursery, a lot of the plants are marketed as vigorous and quick climbing and rapid self-sowers, all those attributes that we want. Unfortunately, that's exactly what invasive plants do. They spread via either prolific seed production or far-reaching rhizomes or kind of extensive layering. And because they spread rapidly, they take over an area. And eventually they become so dense that they create a monoculture. And so you will see, and we will talk about some plants that do exactly that.
That's a monoculture.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And there are more pictures of those. In doing so, they drive out all the other plants, and that in turn drives out wildlife and various insects. So it really decreases the biodiversity. The other thing, though, is that in certain cases, some of the invasive plants really clog our waterways. They completely take over basic wetlands. They can take over ponds and riverbeds. In the process, again, driving out wildlife, they also degrade the water quality. There's also an increased fire risk from some of these invasives. Anybody from Menor who's been around for a while remembers the marsh and the fires at the marsh. And finally, they do invade agricultural grazing areas. And we talk about one of them that definitely does that. In talking about managing and trying to control some of these invasives, we will mention herbicides because unfortunately, or fortunately, that's the way that a lot of these can be controlled. You do need to be really careful. We always encourage everyone to check the labels, get as much information as you can about how these herbicides should be used, where they should be used, and what you need to do to protect yourself and the environment. Anything to add to that?
Nope.
Okay. All right, so we're going to talk about a few of the invasive plants in Northeast Ohio. And I'm going to start with garlic mustard. It is, as you can tell from its name, in the mustard family. In its natural range, before I denigrate this plant, in its natural range, it does support like 69 species of insects. Humans use it for food, and some use it for medicinal purposes, which I can't talk about as a master gardener. But at any rate, it does have its benefits. The problem is that it sets up these colonies, and you will see it in woodlands and along waterways, and it again kind of sets up a monoculture, if you will. It is a biennial, which means that in the first year it does one thing, and in the second year it does something else. In the first year, it tends to be low ground, and the leaves are shaped differently than in the second year. The second year is the reproductive year, kind of it bolts, if you will, and it can get to be probably 3 to 4 feet high, in some cases at least. The photos show the first year is on the top, and the second year is on the bottom, and they show the ground level and then the more reproductive. The leaves are different in the 2 years, and it is not a hard plant to recognize. I would suspect that many of you have seen it. It does have pods, if you will, the fruit. They turn brown and brittle in the fall, and they do what's called seed shatter, so the seeds go all over the place. How it spreads is by seeds. It's a prolific seed producer. As you can see, you can get 20,000 seeds per square foot if you have a dense stand of it. It will very quickly cover a forest understory, and a stand can double in a single year. So it will move very quickly. It does have a taproot, so when you talk about controlling it, it doesn't regenerate from the root, so it means that you can pull it. And even if you leave behind a little bit, it is not necessarily going to regenerate. So if you remove the shoot tissue and the root crown, you probably have it. However, you should bag it when you pull it out and remove it from any area, because it's a plant that germinates an entire season. And so when you pull it out, you may be pulling out a plant with live seeds.
So I'll add one other quick thing to the garlic mustard, and that is that the seeds are viable for the garlic mustard for 7 years. So you may have to continue to keep pulling it out.
Yeah.
And she also talked about bagging these. A lot of these plants shouldn't be thrown away in the yard waste, because depending upon how they reproduce, if they will reproduce from a portion of the plant, either the roots or the stems or whatever, or the seeds like in the garlic mustard case, those can then get into someone else's garden. I have a big trouble with the lesser calendine, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, because it came in on somebody's mulch. So bush honeysuckle. So I'm going to talk about several different bushes that are invasive. Then we'll talk a little bit about how to take care of each of all of those. And I'm kind of grouping them together because the treatment is the same, right? So bush honeysuckle is a large bush. It can get up to 20 feet high. It can grow 4 to 6 feet in a single year. So as Linda said, these are things that this was brought in as a landscape plant because it's got this beautiful spring flower, blooms early in the spring, smells great, has fall interest because of the red berries. But the birds love those red berries, and unfortunately the seeds that are in those red berries don't digest. They reproduce wherever the bird leaves them. So when they eat them, it goes through their system, and wherever they leave them, that's where those seeds go. Beautiful plant, but I have seen this plant get so dense within parks that you can't even walk through. The birds can't even get through. So autumn olive is another one that can be very similar. It's also a large bush. It has sort of shimmery silvery leaves, particularly in the spring. So this is just identification. It has white flowers, and it has sort of a mottled red fruit in the fall. Again, it's a beautiful bush. Again, brought in as a landscape plant. And then the other one that I'm going to talk about here in this trio here is common buckthorn. This one is very invasive in this area. At least it is in my yard. I had lots of it when I moved in. It's a small tree with these shiny, rounded leaves, and it has very dark black, almost black berries. The berries of all three of these plants are coming out now, and they bloom in the spring. One more on this list is Callery Pear, or Bradford pear is one of the Callery Pear options. This is a medium-sized tree, right? So we use it a lot as a street tree, a landscape tree. It's a beautiful blooming in the spring, but you can see in this picture on the right side, it takes over, and this is really easy to identify on the roadsides in the early spring when they're in bloom, right? Because you just see the sea of white trees. Again, it's got sort of a little hard berry in the fall. The fall berry is not very exciting. It looks like a little tiny pea-sized pear, sort of brown. But the way you take care of, these all will spread primarily through birds transporting the seeds. They can also spread through root growth, but that's kind of secondary. The treatment is the same in all of these. If it's fairly small, you can pull it out, dig it up. Once it starts to get bigger, you can cut the stumps, but any cut stumps will resprout from the stump if you don't treat those. So at that point, you treat the stump, and what you do is you cut it off, and then you spray it with like a glyphosate and I can't pronounce these names, combination, actually like right into the stump, so the life of a tree or a bush is on the outside rim of the bark, just underneath the bark, right? So if you can get that portion of the plant sprayed with this stuff, within a half an hour of cutting it, it will actually absorb that down into the roots, and then that will kill the roots. For larger trees, you can do what's called girdle and then spray the cuts. So this is a picture of a tree that's been girdled. So basically you're reaching that inner cambium layer where all the life of the plant goes up and down, all the sap runs up and down in the plant, and you spray into that, and again it will absorb that down into the base of the tree, the roots. This takes a little bit longer, so you can do this now, but it won't actually die until probably next year. So if it's producing berries, you might want to cut it and then spray it.
Okay, multiflora rose. This is a plant that was originally introduced into the U.S. as a rootstock for ornamental roses. And it was planted after it actually was here as a living fence in some places, or for erosion control, or even for cover for wildlife. Full disclosure, way back in the 70s, my husband and I planted an entire border of this because we had an ugly chain link fence, and after all, it was a rose. And I'm guessing, we haven't been to that house in 40 years, I'm guessing it's still there because it is difficult to get rid of once it gets going. It is a plant that is all over the place at this point. I mean, it's from Nova Scotia to Florida, and as far west as Texas, and there's even some outbreaks, if you will, on the West Coast. It does thrive in poor growing areas. It's found in abandoned fields, along hedgerows, and along forest edges. It is, again, it's kind of a pretty plant. It has very nice white clusters of flowers in the spring. It does have red berries, or hips, if you will, in the fall. It has a very vigorous root system, and therein lies the difficulty with it. The canes are a very vibrant olive green, and they stay that way all year, so that's one way to distinguish them from native roses, and like if you think you've got climbing roses, for example, or from raspberries or blackberries. So there are ways to distinguish it. It spreads by seed. The birds help here, again, because they eat the hips, and there are prolific seed producer because an individual rose can produce 500,000 seeds. I mean, they're everywhere. They also advance or expand by layering. The canes arc over, they then root in the ground, and then they just keep reproducing themselves that way. It is very difficult to completely eradicate this particular plant. If you pull it very early, you can possibly get control, but the thorns are very problematic, and the roots are pretty long. The other way, though, is mostly by mowing and herbicides, unfortunately. There's not much else you can do. You do see these in fields, and they look like clumps like this because they've just basically arced over, and they just climb over anything that's around. And so you see it in a lot of abandoned fields. The next plants are the common and the Japanese barberry. The common barberry has been here for centuries. The Japanese barberry is more recent and was really introduced as an ornamental replacement for the common barberry because it was resistant to or didn't transmit black stem rust. These were, especially the Japanese barberry, were prominent in suburban landscapes in the 60s when I was a kid. They were everywhere. Everyone had one of these. They are different, and the differences are on the slide. I mean, they have different shaped leaves in terms of the margins. The flowers are similar, but the common barberry is yellow, and the Japanese it may be white or cream color up to white, or yellow. They have spines or thorns. Those are different on the two different types, and the Japanese barberry usually doesn't get much taller than 4 feet. They might get up to 6 feet, but more likely 4. And the common barberry may get up to 8 to 10 feet. So they're usually much bigger. There are two very key ways to distinguish the two. The Japanese barberry has a yellow Cambrian layer under the bark and also has yellow roots. As I said earlier, they spread by the birds mostly, and they do have rhizomes. They do some layering as well. Treatment obviously is if it's an early invasion, you can try pulling. That sometimes works. You can also try to cut them before there's any fruiting. Mostly, you have to mow them and then follow up. And follow up usually with some kind of herbicide. They're very difficult to control, though. Now, one note, there has been some recent research and studies that have documented a relationship between the Japanese barberry and deer ticks. Because of the architecture of the plant, it's a bushy, dense, low shrub. It sets up an environment, or at least some protection for ticks from extreme changes in temperature and humidity, and it also provides refuge for the white-footed mouse, which those of you who are tick fans know is kind of the host for the ticks. So there are multiple reasons to get rid of this particular plant.
Okay, so this is my picture of that lesser celandine. So one of the interesting things about this particular plant is it's a spring ephemeral, which means that it comes up early in the spring and it's really beautiful, and then it dies back. It looks like it dies back, right? So, and then your ground just looks dead and barren for the rest of the year because nothing else will grow around it because the root masses are so dense. And while it looks like it's dead, it's spreading underneath the ground. So this plant primarily, well, so from identification, it has this nice kind of a rounded shaped leaves that are kind of glossy, buttercup-like flower with 9 petals. It spreads by the rhizomes or the root system. It has a very massive, very dense root system. And then it also spreads by plant movement parts. So if you pull it out and put it, as I said before, you pull it out, put it in your yard waste, and that ends up in someone else's compost or mulch, then they get it too, right? So that's why a lot of these are very important to throw into your trash, not your yard waste. Even though you think you're being environmentally smart by putting things in your yard waste, sometimes that's not so smart. This does spread by seeds as well. In my yard, this seems to spread, I think, primarily by deer feet. The deer actually wander through it, pick it up, and then move it to a different place. So I end up with little pieces of it like this in my yard, right? So the treatment of it may require multiple treatments. You can dig it, but you got to get all of that root system, all the little bulblets, all the little rhizomes, but again, burn or dispose of it in your trash. You can use a non-selective pre-emergent, post-emergent systemic, such as glyphosate, but again, that's going to kill your grass too, right? So this one is very difficult because even with something like 2,4-D, which is a broadleaf herbicide, it doesn't always kill it totally the first time. And so you may have to go back and treat it again. And you think you got it because it goes dormant for the summer, and then next spring it comes back and it's bigger than it was. So this is kind of a weird one from that time. So the best time to apply any herbicide to this is from the first frost, when it first appears, until into its blooming, but not totally done blooming. And you may need to do multiple applications over multiple years.
Okay, purple loosestrife. Isn't it pretty? I really like it. I think it's a very pretty plant. I think this is a plant that reminds us that pretty isn't always good. There's the problem. It is considered a noxious weed in many states, and in other states it's sold at nurseries. It's got multiple personalities, I guess. It's a nice garden flower. I mean, it's a perennial. It gets this dense bush of lots of stems. It has tall spikes, and it has very pretty flowers. Mm-hmm. So it's got a lot going for it. The problem is that it gets very dense, and it likes waterways and marshes and wetlands. And it really does pose a great threat to wetlands because once it's established, that dense plant that looks okay in your garden basically is impenetrable by boats, and it's really hard to even walk through it. So it ruins the wetlands as a habitat for animals, and birds and mammals and waterfowl don't like it. So it doesn't provide any food for them. It wipes out the other plants that they might truly rely on. So it is a big problem when it gets out of your garden, or my garden, if you will. This is an example of one where we might well be growing it and perhaps shouldn't. It is another prolific seed producer. It can produce up to 1 to 2 million seeds. And they are spread not by birds this time, but by wind or floating in the waterway. And they'll float down a waterway, for example, or disturbance of land. Now, isn't that pretty? For those of us who like waves of color, That's very pretty, but it's now kind of a destroyed wetlands in terms of being a habitat for anything else, if you will. Controlling it, clearly, if you see it, you should pull it. It's that kind of thing. It requires a lot of mowing and then herbicides again. My advice would be, don't plant it. You may think it's not spreading because it's not spreading in your yard, but it is likely spreading, at least on the wind, if nothing else. Look out for volunteers and isolated small colonies and try to remove them. And this is another one where if you cut off the flower, even if you have it in your yard, if you cut off the flower and bag it and dispose of it, you probably will be saving the environment from a lot of random seeds, if you will. There are some alternatives for your garden if you love this look. Gay feather or grass-leaved blazing star or even purple coneflower will kind of look the same, if you will, or create the same appearance.
So Japanese knotweed, this is one that was relatively new to me, but again, this one is a water plant. It's a water-ish. It loves to be really close to the water. So for identification, it pretty much dies back every fall, but it comes up with these single bamboo-like shoots, and it has sort of a zigzaggy pattern, which on the next slide you'll see pretty clearly, with these kind of heart-shaped leaves. It does tend to grow near streams, and how it spreads is by its rhizomes or its root systems, primarily. But it also will reroot from any branch part, any root part, any branch part. And so what happens is it grows near streams, and then the streams get eroded, and then they wash downstream. And so they spread through a lot of their spreading is done by movement of a part of the plant, either by humans, animals, or by water. So treatment, you have to cut it down early in the spring, burn it or put it in your trash as it will resprout, and then spray. You may need to, once it resprouts, because you cut it down, once it resprouts, then you'll have to either keep cutting it down, keep cutting it, or you can spray it at that point about 2 months later. Just be careful not to spray into your stream that's nearby. One of the things that Linda was talking about from the seed distribution, a lot of these are, you put these seeds, these flowers into the trash or into the compost or whatever, and those seeds still continue to be viable, even if it doesn't look like they will be, right? So one of the ladies over here, Michelle, was talking about pokeweed. I put pokeweed in my compost one time, and I couldn't get rid of it for the rest of the 10 years I lived at that house, right? Because it just kept coming back from that root part, because similar kind of thing in this case.
Phragmites. I'm sure you've all seen this. If you've driven down any highway, you've seen this plant. It is a non-native perennial wetland grass. There are native Phragmites. The one that really has kind of escaped and become invasive is Australian, and it will drive out any natives anyway. So what you're probably seeing is this one. It is herbaceous. It has huge rhizomes, and it is hard to pull up, if you will, or dig up. It is found in wetlands and low areas, and in roadside ditches and retention ponds and along rivers and along the edges of shores and even along the guardrails. It will grow almost anywhere that is disturbed or near water, either one. It typically gets to 6 to 10 feet, but it can top out at 20. There's a picture on the next slide of it dwarfing a person. This time of year, you see the panicles. They look wonderful. I mean, they look very pretty. It is not an unpleasant looking plant. It looks like a nice plant. The problem is that it will just wipe out a wetlands. I mentioned earlier the Menor Marsh. This is the plant that did in the Menor Marsh over a period of time after salt got into it and other stuff. And it survived there and nothing else did. And then it kept catching fire. It took a village to get it out of there. And I don't know if it's completely out now, but I think it's pretty close. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History has taken over that property, and they literally used helicopters to spray. They went in, mowed it all down. They had to use aquatic mechanisms. It is difficult to get rid of a stand of phragmites because there's water, and so you have to be careful with any herbicides you use, and you need special equipment for mowing it and trying to dig it up. If you see it, most people don't have it in their yards, so it is not typically something that you might have in your yards, but if you have a pond, you may start to see it. And if you live along a river, you may start to see it. So it is something that people need to be cognizant of and try to get rid of wherever they can. It's not something you're likely to plant in your own yard. It does impair the use of water on wetlands, both for recreation and tourism, as well as for wildlife. The marsh, for example, they're only now being able to bring back native plants, which they hope will bring back native wildlife. So it is something that is, it does literally take a lot of work to get rid of it. And as pretty as it might look along the roadsides waving in the wind, it is a big, big problem.
Kudzu, or otherwise affectionately known as the vine that ate the South.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know how many of you guys know that this actually will grow in Ohio, in Northeast Ohio. It has actually been identified in various areas, not in Lake County that I know of, but certainly in Cuyahoga and Ashtabula and Geauga County. So it's all surrounding us, right? Not the big stands that you used to see, as you drive. We used to drive down 75 to Florida, and that's all you saw for hundreds of miles, it seemed like. It's a very vigorous vine that will drape over everything and kill what's underneath because the plant underneath doesn't get any light and competes for waters and nutrients and so forth. It has 3 leaves, so you think it might be poison ivy, but it's not poison ivy. And it has a beautiful little purple flower. So, we brought this one in as an erosion control for roadsides primarily. That's how this one got here. Spreads primarily through runners and also the root system, right? So Linda talked about layering. It does layering. So where it touches the ground, it can reroot. It has runners that run underneath the ground that can reroot and start up again. Any part of this plant that will touch the soil will reroot again, even if it's no longer attached to its mother plant. It will still reroot. Treatment for this is herbicides, repeated mowing. Obviously, it's really hard to mow it once it's up into the trees. But once you can kind of get it under control and pull it down out of the trees, then you can continue to mow it down. But it takes several years of continuous mowing to get it under control, or you can spray it. So I think that's all. Those are the ones that we had to talk about today. So these are some, this first link here, if you're interested in alternatives for any of these, this gives you some alternative plants, as well as some additional information on invasive species control. And you'll notice that if you go to the first link under here, the OSU EDU Resources Invasive Species, it actually has a lot of this information, and a lot of this information actually came from that website. So, I don't have a slide for questions. Typically I do. So if anybody has any questions, we will, Midge, Stephanie, can you turn the light back on to?
Yeah, let's go back to the last slide.
Thank you, Midge. Yes?
Is You know, the grapevines you see all over our forest that just look like that kudzu, kind of
So the question is, are the grapevines that are draping all over our forests invasive? That is a great question of which I have had and I don't know the answer to. Does anyone else? I
don't.
think those are native.
But they'll spread up and climb up trees.
But they will
Yeah.
spread and climb up trees. What I don't know is whether or not they will kill the trees underneath them, so like the kudzu does. So I don't know the answer to that. If you call the helpline, Dave will help you figure it out.
Earlier in your presentation, you talked about bagging some of the cuttings that you take from the plant. Later on, you mentioned burning. Now, how about the ones at the beginning? Can you burn them too if you're allowed to burn where you live?
If you're allowed, well, so if you're allowed to burn where you live, so a lot of the communities, like I live in Minter, it's our zoning rules say you can burn for entertainment purposes, but not
Just take a
for
hot dog out with you when you burn.
right,
Yeah.
but not for plant disposal. You know, because they don't want you burning leaves and stuff. If you are allowed burning or putting them in the trash, it works. Yeah.
You mentioned like the earlier species you showed, and you just mentioned bagging them.
Yeah, any of them that we say bagging could be burned if you can burn them, right? So the challenge is that a lot of them, they're a green growth, and you want to get rid of them while they're still green growth, so it's harder to burn. She talked about phragmites. Phragmites is controlled through controlled burns a lot of times. So, great question. Diane, did you have a question?
Yeah, if you're going to bag, if you bag something and it's got the viable pods in there, and you put it in the trash, isn't there that chance that the bag would deteriorate, you know, decompose or get broken and those would, I mean, should you maybe keep them for a little while and let the heat of the sun or something kind of help destroy them while they're in that dark environment?
Okay, so the question is it possible that the bag that you put the trash into will break open and therefore, you know, still you're spreading it? So I would say two things. One is, yes, you can leave that bag of trash out in the sun and it will kind of, for a week or so, a couple of weeks, and it will start to disintegrate that and kill that down, and then you can put it in the trash and it's less likely to do that. The other thing is that most of our trash is buried under, 12 feet of other trash, and so once it gets into the trash system, it's unlikely that it's going to be exposed enough to actually spread because it is buried.
I have a whole list of questions, but I'm only going to ask two. Isn't phragmites attracted to the road salt? I've heard that a couple of times.
Is phragmites attracted to the road salt?
Well, I don't know that. It grew in Menor Marsh, and it was the only thing that could grow there after the salt got into it. I don't know that it's attracted to the salt. It is something that can grow just in land that salt has, infiltrated one way or another. I don't think we stop using road salt to prevent phragmites.
Somebody else?
I just want to say I have this little pond, and the plants I got this year to put on it all burned up. I just wonder if the hotter temperatures help to destroy these other plants.
So the question is, would the hotter temperatures and lack of water that we have this year help destroy some of these other plants? Possibly, but probably not. They're pretty well suited to, unless you take away all the water, which it sounds like you had your problem with. If you take the marsh, for example, and it's dry, it might kill those, but most of these are going to be pretty resilient and come back the next year. The ones we've talked about.
A lot of them have very significant root systems,
Yes.
so they can withstand drought and high temperatures.
Other than pulling, how do you get rid of thistle? That probably came up mulch.
Other than pulling, how do you get rid of thistle? So,
Dig it, pull
well,
it.
you got to keep pulling it and digging it. I have actually found the best way because like 2,4-D or like a broadleaf herbicide don't really seem to take care of thistle in my experience. And now I'm just talking from experience, but boiling water does. So, yeah, that's,
My grandmother used that on everything.
Do cities such as Mentor, do they work with the state extension to find out what they should be planting and not planting? Because I know each city has its own group of people that decide what's going to be planted.
so the question is, do the cities in this area work with the
State.
state? I have no clue. This is a state law. What I gave you is a state law. So I'm hoping that they're looking at that.
So if I see a patch of purple loosestrife, I can tell the city where I see it, and maybe they would want to control it before it goes.
You can certainly try.
I don't like using Roundup.
So I've been using vinegar,
Uh-huh.
kill weeds. Do you recommend like a natural, I mean, is that a good idea? Vinegar?
So the question is, instead of using Roundup or some other kind of broadleaf herbicide, can we use vinegar? Does anybody have an opinion on vinegar?
It works in the driveway.
It works.
Yeah, but what does it do
Carol,
to soil?
what's your opinion?
It's it's an acid.
Yeah.
And if you're using it extensively in your garden, you're changing the pH of your garden. So I would not, and I don't think there's been any research-based information saying that you should use it.
You
So-
have to use concentrated vinegar, 30%, get it at Lowe's. Don't use 5%, it doesn't work.
So a concentrated vinegar, not the 5% we typically table vinegar. However, to Carol's point, is it will change your pH in your soil. Again, that's not something that is research-based. It's sort of it's what people's experience is. It will kill plants, but it might kill the ones you don't want to.
I've been using it in the driveway.
That's why I like boiling water.
Could you explain research-based so people know if they want to go look for more information on their?
Great question. So for research-based, so Master Gardeners are part of OSU Extension. So Ohio State University, we give you research-based information. So this is information that is backed up by research by universities and credible organizations, right? So in order to find that information, it's really easy to do on Google. You search for whatever it is you're looking for, .edu. So that's how we got most of this information. So any of the information that we have up here, we got off of online and off of the EDU sites. So
I will say, after you find it, make sure that it is, if you're trying to find something about Ohio, that you limit it to the Midwest. Arizona State isn't going to help you much in terms of plants here, but there are lots of great resources that universities have out online. Ohio State is only one. Michigan State has a lot. Penn State is
Purdue.
terrific, and Purdue.
Purdue has a lot. Missouri even.
Yeah.
So my big ones are Missouri, which is questionable, but Purdue, Penn State, and Michigan. Yeah. Any other questions?
Do you have any experience eradicating bishop's weed?
I wish I did, because I have a ton of it in my yard. Bishop's goutweed, bishop's weed, or bishop's goutweed, or goutweed. Again, it's not really it's not legally, but I would love if anybody has a way to get rid of it, because I have a ton of it.
I have an area that I control bishop weed in because I want it as a ground cover. And I noticed when they put my mulch down this year, if they overdid it on the bishop weed, those areas were gone.
Interesting.
So evidently the combination of what was the mulch and the loss of light and that type of thing, it's dead. So just suffocating it worked in areas that I really didn't want it to be suffocated in, but
So
Let's check next spring.
So her experience is, again, this is not research-based because we don't know. Her experience is heavy mulch. My experience is you can kind of control it with mowing too, multiple mowings. Or at least I can keep it within a confined area. So one of the things that I forgot to tell you, the list that we did, we actually started with a actually a Geauga Parks naturalist, Geauga and Lake naturalist, and said, what are the things that you find are the most problematic in the metro parks? And that's actually how we, and then we added a couple that we have our own issues with. But that's actually how we started our list, was ones that have escaped primarily into our metro parks. But your point is, burning bush is, I would consider it, I see it on noxious weed lists, but it's not on the state legal list.
Thank you.
But there is a website, there is a Ohio noxious weed list out there. If you just Google that, Ohio noxious weeds, it's a bigger list than the one we gave you. There's so many we could talk about we could be here all day. I think we're about out of time, so unless anybody else has anything else, those of you who did bring samples, if my Master Gardener friends can help us with that, thank you for coming.
Thank you.